Greetings, everyone. I am the scary Midnight Story, here to guide you into a peaceful slumber tonight. But before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment letting us know where you're from and what time it is in your country right now. The Crimson Feast. The invitation arrived on thick crimson paper, sealed with a wax emblem depicting an ornate chalice. No return address, no explanation, just a time, a date, and a location. For those who received it, the meaning was clear. They had been chosen. The Château de Sangre stood on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind towering iron gates and dense ancient woods. The building itself was an architectural marvel, its Gothic spires clawing at the night sky, windows glowing faintly with an eerie red light. The chosen guests arrived in silence, their sleek cars gliding up the gravel drive. Each one was a figure of influence, CEOs, politicians, artists, and celebrities, bound by a shared hunger for exclusivity and power. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wine and exotic spices. The dining hall was a vision of opulence. A long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, adorned with silver candelabras and crimson roses. At its center sat an enormous feast, the likes of which none had ever seen. Platters of roasted meats, bowls of glistening fruits, and decanters of deep red wine shimmered in the flickering candlelight. Their host, a man known only as Alaric, stood at the head of the table. His presence was magnetic, his voice a smooth blend of charm and authority. He welcomed them with a toast, his words cryptic yet intoxicating. Tonight, we indulge not just in food, but in the essence of life itself. To the feast, and to the secrets we shall share. The guests ate ravenously, the flavors unlike anything they had ever tasted. Each bite seemed to ignite something within them, a warmth, a vitality, a hunger they couldn't quite place. The wine flowed freely, and the room buzzed with laughter and conversation. Yet beneath the surface, unease simmered. As the night wore on, subtle changes began to take hold. The laughter grew sharper, the conversations more heated. Faces flushed unnaturally, eyes gleamed with an unsettling light. The food, once so enticing, now seemed to glisten with a sinister sheen. Then came the first scream. One of the guests, a young tech mogul, clutched his throat and collapsed onto the table. Blood trickled from his nose, his eyes wide with terror. The others recoiled, but Alaric remained calm, his smile unbroken. "Do not fear," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The feast is merely beginning." The doors to the dining hall slammed shut, and the candles flickered ominously. Alaric's eyes glowed with a crimson hue as he raised his glass. "You were chosen not for who you are, but for what you offer. Tonight, the feast demands more than your appetites. It demands your essence." The guests tried to flee, but the room seemed to warp around them. The walls pulsed as if alive, the air thick with an oppressive force. The food on the table writhed and twisted, revealing its true nature, flesh, sinew, and bone. One by one, the guests were consumed, not by the feast, but by it. The table itself seemed to hunger, dragging them into its depths. Their screams echoed through the hall as Alaric watched, his expression one of rapture. By dawn, the dining hall was silent. The table was empty, save for Alaric and a single glass of wine, now filled with a thick crimson liquid. He raised it to his lips and drank deeply, a satisfied smile playing across his face. The Château de Sangre would remain quiet for another year, its secrets hidden from the world. But the invitations would go out again, and the feast would continue. For in the Crimson Feast, the line between predator and prey was as thin as the edge of a blade, and just as sharp. The midnight soiree. The invitation arrived on a crisp, moonlit evening, its envelope black as night and sealed with crimson wax. Isabel turned it over in her hands, her curiosity piqued by the absence of a return address. The elegant script on the front bore only her name and the phrase, "You are cordially invited to an exclusive midnight soiree." Inside, the card was equally mysterious. It provided no location, only a time, midnight, and instructions to wait outside her apartment. Despite her better judgment, Isabel felt compelled to attend. She was new to the city, her life dull and monotonous. This was a chance to step into something thrilling, something extraordinary. At precisely midnight, a sleek black car pulled up to her building. The driver, a man dressed in a tailored suit with an unsettlingly blank expression, opened the door for her. "Miss Isabel," he said, his voice low and smooth, "your carriage awaits." The car wound through the city, its windows tinted so darkly that Isabel could see nothing of their route. The journey seemed to stretch endlessly, the silence inside the vehicle thick and oppressive. Finally, the car stopped in front of a grand mansion shrouded in mist. Its towering spires and Gothic architecture loomed like a shadow against the starless sky. A butler greeted her at the door, his face pale and expressionless. He led her into a lavish ballroom illuminated by chandeliers that cast an eerie golden glow. The room was filled with elegantly dressed guests, their faces obscured by ornate masks. The air buzzed with a strange energy, a mix of opulence and something far darker. Isabel was handed a mask, black with intricate silver detailing, and a glass of champagne. She sipped nervously, observing the crowd. The guests moved with an unsettling grace, their laughter too perfect, their movements too synchronized. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As the clock struck 1, the host appeared. A tall, commanding figure dressed in deep crimson robes, his face hidden beneath a mask shaped like a snarling wolf. He raised a gloved hand, and the room fell silent. "Welcome, my esteemed guests," he said, his voice resonating with a chilling authority. "Tonight, you join us in a sacred tradition, one that has endured for centuries. Tonight, we honor the old ones." The guests erupted into applause, their masked faces turning toward Isabel. Her stomach tightened as she realized she was the only one without a clue about what was happening. The host continued, gesturing toward a grand staircase that spiraled into darkness. "The time has come to choose. One among us will ascend, and one will descend. The balance must be maintained." Isabel's heart raced as the guests turned their attention to her. She tried to back away, but the crowd closed in, their masked faces eerily calm. The host extended a hand toward her, his gloved fingers beckoning. "Do not fear," he said, his tone almost soothing. "You were chosen for this honor." Before she could protest, she was guided up the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, the whispers of the crowd fading into an oppressive silence. At the top, she was led into a room illuminated by a single flickering candle. In the center stood an altar carved from black stone, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift under her gaze. The host stood beside her, his presence towering and menacing. "Kneel," he commanded. Isabel hesitated, but the weight of the moment pressed her to her knees. The host placed a dagger in her hands, its blade shimmering with an unnatural light. "You must choose," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Sacrifice another, or offer yourself. The old ones demand blood." Tears streamed down Isabel's face as she stared at the blade. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. She could feel the weight of countless eyes watching, waiting for her decision. In a surge of defiance, she turned the blade on the host. But as she struck, the dagger passed through him like smoke. His laughter echoed through the room, cold and mocking. "You cannot escape the pact," he said. his voice reverberating with inhuman power. The choice was never yours to make. The candle extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Isabel felt herself falling, her screams swallowed by the void. When she awoke, she was back in her apartment, the invitation resting on her bedside table. But something was different. Her reflection in the mirror showed her eyes glowing faintly, her shadow moving independently of her. The midnight soiree had marked her, and she knew the old ones were not finished with her yet. The mirror's desire. In the dim light of an antique shop tucked away on a forgotten street, Olivia found the mirror. Its ornate, gilded frame gleamed with an unnatural luster, intricate carvings of twisting vines and anguished faces etched into the gold. The glass itself was pristine, as if untouched by time, reflecting her image with unsettling clarity. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with clouded eyes and a voice like dry leaves, noticed her lingering gaze. "Ah, the mirror of avarice," he said, his words laced with a peculiar reverence. "A rare piece. It's said to show more than just your reflection. It reveals what you desire most." Olivia hesitated, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the frame. She was drawn to it, a magnetic pull she couldn't explain. The price was steep, but she couldn't resist. With trembling hands, she handed over her credit card and carried the mirror home, unaware of the dark bargain she had just struck. That night she hung the mirror in her bedroom, its presence dominating the space. The moment it was mounted, the air seemed heavier, charged with an unseen energy. She stood before it, her reflection staring back at her. For a moment, everything was normal. Then, the image shifted. In the mirror, Olivia saw herself in a luxurious penthouse, draped in designer clothes, surrounded by adoring fans. Her paintings, work she had struggled for years to sell, were displayed in prestigious galleries, fetching unimaginable sums. The vision was intoxicating, a glimpse of the life she had always dreamed of. But as she reached out to touch the glass, the reflection warped. Her face twisted into a cruel smile, her eyes gleaming with malice. The scene behind her darkened, the adoring fans turning to shadows that clawed at her. Startled, she stumbled back, the vision fading to her ordinary reflection. The next morning, Olivia dismissed the experience as a vivid dream, but the mirror's allure was impossible to ignore. Each time she looked into it, it revealed more of her desires: fame, wealth, love. The visions were so vivid, so tantalizing, that she began to crave them. One evening, the mirror offered her a new image. Her rival, an artist who had always overshadowed her, lying in ruins. The scene was detailed, showing Olivia triumphing as her rival's career crumbled. A voice, soft and seductive, whispered from the depths of the glass. "You can have it all," it said. "All you need to do is act." At first, Olivia resisted, but the visions grew more persistent, the voice more persuasive. It promised her everything she had ever wanted if she simply followed its guidance. Desperation and envy clouded her judgment, and she began to heed its whispers. The mirror's instructions were subtle at first, small acts of sabotage, harmless lies. But as Olivia's success grew, so did the mirror's demands. It urged her to betray friends, manipulate lovers, and destroy her rivals. Each act brought her closer to the life she had seen in the mirror, but it also left her feeling hollow, her soul eroding with every step. One night, as Olivia stood before the mirror, it showed her something new. Herself, older, surrounded by wealth and fame, but utterly alone. Her face was gaunt, her eyes void of warmth. The voice spoke again, colder this time. "This is your future," it said, "unless you give me what I truly desire." "What do you want?" Olivia demanded, her voice trembling. Your soul, the mirror replied, its surface rippling like water. Surrender it, and you will have everything you've ever dreamed of. Terrified, Olivia tried to smash the mirror, but the glass would not break. The frame seemed to writhe under her hands, the carved faces leering at her. The mirror's voice grew louder, echoing in her mind, drowning out her thoughts. Desperate, she fled her apartment, leaving the mirror behind. But no matter where she went, its whispers followed her. She saw its reflection in every surface, its promises haunting her dreams. Days turned to weeks, and Olivia's life unraveled. Her once promising career faltered, her relationships crumbled, and her mind teetered on the edge of madness. The mirror's curse had ensnared her, binding her to its will. One fateful night, unable to endure the torment any longer, Olivia returned to the mirror. Her reflection greeted her with a triumphant smile, its eyes gleaming with malice. "Do you accept my terms?" the mirror asked, its voice a seductive purr. With tears streaming down her face, Olivia nodded. The glass rippled, and her reflection stepped forward, merging with her. A cold, searing pain consumed her as the mirror claimed her soul. When the sun rose the next morning, Olivia was gone. The mirror hung silently on the wall, its surface pristine once more. In its depths, faint whispers echoed, the voices of those it had claimed over the centuries. And in the dim light of the antique shop, the elderly shopkeeper prepared for his next customer. The sinister contract. The rain hammered against the cracked windows of Marla's tiny studio, its relentless rhythm a cruel mockery of her own dwindling hopes. She stared at the blank canvas before her, the scattered tubes of paint on the floor, and the stack of unpaid bills on the corner of her desk. Her dreams of becoming a renowned artist had long since turned into a waking nightmare of rejection and obscurity. That night, as the storm raged on, a knock echoed through the studio. Marla froze, her brush mid-air. She hadn't expected anyone, least of all at this hour. When she opened the door, a man stood there, tall and impossibly elegant, his dark coat untouched by the rain. "Good evening, Miss Rivers," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "May I come in?" Something about him unnerved her, his piercing eyes, the faint curve of his lips, as if he were perpetually on the verge of a secret smile. Yet she stepped aside, unable to resist the pull of his presence. He introduced himself as Lucian, a patron of the arts, and claimed to have seen her work at a small gallery exhibit months prior. "You have talent," he said, pacing the room with a predatory grace. "Raw, untamed, but you lack recognition. I can help with that." Marla laughed bitterly. "And what's the catch? You want a cut of the profits I don't have?" Lucian's smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a shade too sharp. "I require nothing so mundane. All I ask is your signature on a simple contract." He produced a sheet of parchment from his coat, its edges frayed and its surface faintly glowing. The terms were clear: fame, fortune, and artistic immortality in exchange for her soul. Marla hesitated. She didn't believe in souls, not really. And yet, a part of her recoiled at the thought. "What happens when I die?" she asked. Lucian's eyes gleamed. "That is not your concern. Think only of what you'll gain in life." The weight of her failures pressed down on her. She thought of the galleries that had turned her away, the friends who had given up on her, the cold, endless nights spent doubting her worth. With trembling hands, she signed the contract. From that moment, everything changed. Her paintings, once dismissed as amateurish, now drew crowds. Critics hailed her as a genius. Collectors clamored for her work, and her name became synonymous with brilliance. But with each masterpiece she created, a strange unease settled over her. Her art took on a life of its own. The colors seemed to bleed, the images shifting when she wasn't looking. People claimed to see shadows moving in the backgrounds, faces staring back at them with a malevolent intelligence. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs that flitted through her mind as she worked. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out her thoughts entirely. They spoke of darkness, of hunger, of debts unpaid. Marla confronted Lucian in desperation. He appeared as effortlessly composed as ever, lounging in her studio as though he had always belonged there. "You didn't tell me this would happen," she accused, her voice shaking. "You didn't ask," he replied, his tone maddeningly calm. "Fame and fortune always come at a price, my dear. Did you think your soul was the only thing I claimed?" He gestured to her latest painting, a grotesque, nightmarish scene she didn't remember creating. The figures on the canvas writhed and twisted, their faces contorted in eternal agony. "You feed it," Lucian explained, his smile widening. "Every stroke of your brush, every ounce of passion you pour into your work, nourishes the force you've bound yourself to, and it will not be sated until it consumes you entirely." Marla tried to stop painting, but the compulsion was too strong. Her hands moved of their own accord, creating horrors she couldn't comprehend. The fame she had once craved became a prison, the adoration of her fans a cruel reminder of her pact. As the days turned to weeks, she withered. Her reflection in the mirror showed hollow eyes and sunken cheeks, her body little more than a vessel for the malevolent force that had claimed her. One night, as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, Lucian appeared for the final time. "Your time is up," he said, his voice as cold and unyielding as the grave. Marla fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged. "There must be a way to undo this." Lucian crouched before her, his smile devoid of pity. "There is no escape from a deal sealed in blood and desire. But take solace, Marla. You will be remembered. Your art will endure, even as you fade into the shadows." As he spoke, the room darkened, the air growing thick and suffocating. The last thing Marla saw was Lucian's outstretched hand, beckoning her into the abyss. When the sun rose the next morning, her studio was empty, save for a single, unfinished painting. It depicted a woman standing on the edge of a void. The Velvet Shadows. The Velvet Shadows Inn was a place of mystery, perched on a cliff overlooking a tumultuous sea. Its grandeur was undeniable, with dark wood-paneled walls, velvet drapes, and golden chandeliers that cast a warm, almost hypnotic glow. Only the wealthiest and most secretive individuals found their way to its doors, lured by the promise of luxury and discretion. Isabel Duval, the enigmatic proprietress, greeted each guest with a knowing smile and a voice as smooth as silk. Thomas Grayson, a powerful steel magnate, arrived first. His room was lined with mirrors, each more ornate than the last. At first, he admired his reflection, reveling in the opulence. But as the hours passed, the reflections took on a life of their own. They showed him scenes from his past, moments he had long buried, the workers he had overworked, the families he had left destitute. Their faces stared back at him, eyes full of accusation. He tried to shatter the mirrors, but the shards only multiplied the haunting images. By dawn, he was found trembling in the corner, whispering apologies to phantoms no one else could see. Evelyn Hart, a notorious socialite, arrived the following night. Her room was draped in crimson velvet, a setting she found decadent and fitting for her tastes. As she lay in bed, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs, but soon they grew louder, more insistent, calling her name and recounting her cruelties, the lies she had told, the friendships she had destroyed, the lives she had ruined for her own amusement. She covered her ears, but the whispers seeped into her mind, relentless and unforgiving. By morning, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and a single cryptic note. They know. The inn's guests came and went, each drawn to a room tailored to their deepest fears and darkest sins. A banker who had embezzled fortunes found himself drowning in an endless sea of gold coins, each one heavier than the last. A politician who had betrayed his constituents faced the spectral faces of those he had failed, their eyes glowing with silent condemnation. Isabel Duval watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction. She was no ordinary innkeeper. The Velvet Shadows was no ordinary inn. It was a place where the wealthy and powerful came to confront the truths they had long denied, a purgatory disguised as paradise. Each room was a reflection of its occupant's soul, and the price for their stay was far greater than they ever anticipated. As the seasons passed, the inn remained, its velvet curtains fluttering in the sea breeze. New guests arrived, drawn by whispers of its allure, and one by one, they left, if they left at all, forever changed by what they had seen within its walls. The Velvet Shadows fed on their fears, their sins, their secrets, growing ever more powerful with each passing night. The Spectral Huntsman. On a bitter autumn evening, when the wind howled like a pack of wolves and the fog rolled in thick as smoke, Thomas Fairchild, a seasoned traveler, found himself on the edge of the bleak moors of Black Hollow. His journey had led him far from the familiar roads, and the thought of a warm hearth and a hot meal seemed but a distant dream. The moors stretched out before him, a vast, barren expanse of heather and rock, where the sun had long since disappeared behind the heavy clouds, leaving only a dim, ghostly light. He had heard tales of the moors, whispers in the village of a hunter, a man cursed to walk the land for all eternity. The villagers spoke of him in hushed tones, afraid to speak too openly for fear of drawing his attention. The Spectral Huntsman, they called him. A man once known for his prowess with a bow, who had hunted the beasts of the moors with unmatched skill. But something had gone wrong. Something dark had taken hold of him, and now he hunted not animals, but the living, those foolish enough to trespass into his domain. Thomas dismissed these stories as mere superstition, the idle fears of villagers who had little else to occupy their minds. But as he stood on the edge of the moors, a chill ran down his spine. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the fog seemed to creep closer, wrapping around him like a shroud. There was no sound, no birds, no wind, just an eerie silence that pressed in on him from all sides. With a sigh, Thomas pulled his coat tighter around him and set off across the moors, determined to find shelter before the night fully descended. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground, and the mist clung to his skin, cold and damp. He had barely walked a mile when he heard it, a distant sound, like the faint echo of a horn. At first he thought it was a trick of the wind, but then the sound came again, louder this time, carried on the breeze. A hunting horn, deep and mournful, its note hanging in the air like a death knell. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard of the horn before, the one that marked the arrival of the Spectral Huntsman. Fear gripped him, and for a moment he considered turning back, but the fog had thickened, and he could no longer see the path behind him. The sound of the horn grew louder, and with it, the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding against the earth, growing closer, closer still. Thomas's breath quickened as he turned, his eyes scanning the mist for any sign of movement. And then, through the fog, he saw it. A figure, tall and imposing, mounted on a black horse, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The hunter's face was hidden beneath a hood, but the shape of his figure was unmistakable. He was dressed in tattered hunting garb, his bow slung across his back, and in his hand he held a long, gleaming spear. The huntsman's eyes locked onto Thomas's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was no expression on the hunter's face, no recognition, only the cold, empty gaze of a man long lost to the world of the living. The fog swirled around them, and the huntsman raised his spear, pointing it directly at Thomas. Without a word, the huntsman spurred his horse forward, the creature moving with a speed that was unnatural, its hooves barely touching the ground. Thomas's heart raced as he turned and ran, his legs pumping beneath him, but the fog seemed to close in around him, thickening with every step. The sound of the huntsman's pursuit was deafening now, the pounding of hooves, the crackling of the underbrush, and the eerie call of the horn echoing in the distance. Thomas's breath came in ragged gasps, his feet slipping on the damp ground, but the huntsman was always just behind him. His presence felt like a weight on Thomas's chest, pressing him forward with relentless force. He could hear the horse's hooves growing louder, feel the heat of its breath on his neck. But every time he glanced over his shoulder, the huntsman was still a mere shadow, a blur in the mist. The moors seemed endless, the fog closing in tighter, suffocating him. His legs grew heavy, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He could run no longer. The huntsman was upon him. With a final desperate cry, Thomas stumbled, falling to his knees on the cold earth. He felt the presence of the huntsman closing in, the weight of the spear's tip hovering just behind him. And then there was silence. The fog lifted, and the moors stretched out before him, empty and still. The huntsman was gone, as though he had never been there at all. Thomas looked around, confused, his heart still pounding in his chest. He was alone. The fog had cleared, the air was no longer suffocating, and the sound of hooves had faded into the distance. But as Thomas stood, trembling, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. The air was still, and yet, in the distance, he heard the faintest sound.